World Rally Championship, one of the fastest, most dramatic and most exciting motorsports in the world. If you strip back the years, you'll see that what is there now has been built on many years of evolution. This is WRC history, the early years. And it's all very easy to forget that once, just over a century ago, a rally car looked like this. Coming up, would you believe that it was the Mini that started a rallying revolution?
I think, people don't really realise just how good the Mini was across the board.
Jon Vordegaard tells us some of his favourite stories from the past.
When they kissed each other and cried, I understood I had done something very, very big.
And Group B, the ultimate in rally car design, or motorsport gone mad.
It was like being hit by a 20-ton truck from behind when you left the line.
When man invented the motor car in the late 19th century, it was clear that although its main purpose was transportation, human nature wouldn't be able to ignore the competition factor for too long. From 1894, city-to-city road races took place all across the European continent as man satisfied his quest to go faster and further, and motorsport was born.
Well, I think in the early days you couldn't really differentiate between racing and rallying because the early races went from one town to another and the cars started at minute intervals, so it was, and the roads were gravel of course, so it wasn't too different from what we know as rallying today.
Alongside these European road trials, by the early 1900s, immense endurance events were taking place all over the world, including the epic Paris to Peking, first run in 1907 and covering almost 16,000 kilometres.
Then touring became a big thing, and somebody had the great idea that Monte Carlo in January was a lot more pleasant than John O'Groats or Stockholm or wherever they started, so people got into the cars and literally hundreds of people competed in those early Monte Carlo rallies and went down to the Riviera. But of course the roads were nothing like today and the cars were nothing like today. And then if it was a good year and there wasn't too much snow, maybe 150 people would arrive in Monte Carlo with no penalties, so they would have 100 metres along the seafront with a braking test, and the best guy in that would win. And in fact the very first RAC rally in 1934, when it ended up in Torquay, I think, the competition then was 100 yards along the seafront, and it was who could do it slowest without actually stopping. And some Colonel Loughborough, I believe, in a Lanchester, was able to go slower than anybody else, so has the honour of being the first RAC rally winner.
It was the Second World War that saw the increase in the development of a proper road network. Once the continent had begun its recovery and rebuilding, motorsport found a new use for these roads and new speed.
The economies of Europe had grown a bit after the post-war doom and gloom, and suddenly there was a bit more disposable income around, and it was kind of a group of friends would get together and essentially organise a rally, or almost a sort of point-to-point event. But certainly there was a lot more navigation. There was not the style of rallying that we know, with flat-out stages and that sort of thing. Before the event started, there was what they call the concentration run, which is where they would start from various cities around Europe and all arrive in Monte Carlo on a certain day, and then they would start and go out into the Alps from there, and you would have that section would be timed at say 40 miles an hour, so you'd have a very precise amount of time to make it from A to B.
It was the Scandinavians that first adopted the method of closing the roads to allow competitors to race against the clock.
Some countries developed quicker than others. Let's say I think Finland, Sweden were having speed events, while we in Britain were still wearing our cloth caps and blazers, and speed started coming in the 50s and caught on a bit more, so that probably by early to mid-60s really every rally worth its salt was based on speed.
Then cars had been, well, just cars, as they were when they rolled off the production line.
The cars, certainly in the 50s, the cars were proper. They were just road cars. There was no modifications. There was nothing like a roll cage or special seats or anything like that. These cars were just driven from the office. 9 to 5, and then on the weekend they would use them on a rally, and that was it.
In the 50s, they probably went into the factory workshop, where they polished the cylinder heads a bit and put slightly harder brake pads in.
Manufacturers would pick and choose events that they thought would gain them the most publicity. Likewise, they entered whatever car they could.
British Motor Corporation, which of course was enormous in those days, Austin, Morris, MG, Austin Healey, Wolseley, Riley, and they would go to something like the Monte Carlo and they would enter one from every make that they possessed. So they would be trying to get 7 or 8 different class wins. So it really was totally different from what we see here today.
It was purely a hobby to them, and they would just get together at the weekend and essentially throw this rally up, and away they'd go.
And co-drivers, well, they really were co-drivers.
And it was literally co-driving, because you were maybe doing 3-4 days at a time. One of the great events of the 50s and 60s was the Liège-Sofia down in Bulgaria. And you left Liège in the north of Belgium and went through all these gravel roads down to Sofia, which took 2.5 days, I think. And there was a 1-hour rest halt in Sofia, and then you turned around and went all the way back. So both guys in the car were clearly driving a lot, the other one was sleeping.
So by the end of the 50s, it was clear that rallying was evolving. Manufacturers were taking an interest and stages were developing, but it was still a long, long way from how we know rallying today. After the break, we see how the Mini changed the face of rallying forever. And we'll see what 600 brake horsepower in a lightweight body shell can do. Welcome back to WRC History, the early years. The most major change in the sport in these early years came in the 60s. It became more professional. At the beginning of the decade, the thought of building a car specifically to participate in a rally couldn't have been further from anyone's mind. But as the 60s began to swing, so did rallying.
Speed came into the sport actually in the 60s, was then already Scandinavian drivers like Rauno Alton and Timo Mäkinen and these kind of people, Erik Karlsson. There were two big teams in the 60s, which was Saab from Sweden, and then basically BMC was a Mini. And they also started preparing a nice team and preparing the cars better, and also starting professional driving.
To some, it was BMC and the Mini that marked the beginning of rallying as a professional sport.
The Mini was a very special car because it just suited rallying so well, and I think people don't really realise just how good the Mini was across the board. It won Acropolis, it won Thousand Lakes, it won Monte Carlo. It won a complete variety of events.
The Mini was a little bit of an underdog because it was not the actual car that should have won all the events, or most of the events, but it was the first professional team that really stretched things to the limit and did a nice preparation and planning like the first professional team around, and therefore it could collect all the successes by avoiding mistakes the others did.
It was quick for its day, probably no quicker than a small Fiesta today, but it was very quick for its time. It was light, it was manoeuvrable, professional team, good drivers, so it punched above its weight.
Stuart Turner was the man behind Mini's success. He was also the first to recognise the untapped talents of Scandinavian drivers.
Stuart Turner was the team manager there, and he had lots of clever ideas like going in recce and then going in longer recces and then having gravel notes and ice notes, lots of things that have been banned today in fact. And yes, there was more professionalism, and he realised these Finns and Swedes had been driving on snow and ice and gravel since the 50s, and signed up lots of people that nobody had ever heard of, like Timo Mäkinen and Rauno Altonen, and started to win RAC rallies and Monte Carlo rallies.
Scandinavia not only produced some of the best drivers of the era, but also the Saab, Mini's biggest rival.
There weren't too many other manufacturers around. Saab were doing a similar job with their 96. And the 96 was a particularly good car as well, but it wasn't designed as a rally car. It became a good rally car from things like the fact that the engine was placed right over the front, the axle and stuff, and so the traction was very good.
Erik Karlsson, who is a very big Swede in this tiny little 840cc Saab, drove like these guys like Jari-Matti Latvala and Mikko Hervonen are driving today, but driving this two-stroke, three-cylinder 850 Saab.
The car was quite narrow, quite high, so it had an awful high gravity, so it rolled quite easily. And these guys just needed to keep the foot down and more or less not lift and catch the speed and take the speed they have. Once you know that thing is rolling, you have to keep it rolling because you have no power to accelerate. And then just little braking as you can and take the momentum with you. It was very different driving in today.
Mini and Saab may have been the big rivals of the 60s, but other manufacturers were beginning to get in on the act. Ford had the Lotus Cortina.
Lotus Cortinas were used a lot, especially when the going was on tarmac, or the Coupe des Alpes, the Rally Geneva, or the Tulip Rally from Holland down to Geneva and up. On all those, I mean, the Lotus Cortina did really well.
The big thing about the Lotus Cortina was that there was this guy called Vic Elford who had a wonderful career. I mean, Vic raced in Formula One, won World Sports Car races, started as a co-driver because he couldn't afford to be a driver. And then he ended up driving a Cortina GT and then a Lotus Cortina. He used to come to Ireland, where I lived, every Easter to do the Circuit of Ireland. And this red Cortina that wouldn't turn anybody's head today. We waited for months to see this thing on Good Friday at Scrutineering in the Circuit of Ireland. So that car had a big place in my heart.
And Porsche brought along a racing car, the magnificent 911.
Well, the Porsche then became a car that
His head today, we waited for months to see this thing on Good Friday at Scrutineering in the Circuit of Ireland.
is an all-the-road section. In those days, on the most difficult events, we had notes all the way from the start to the finish. All the stages and all the road sections as well.
Talking about notes, co-drivers were no longer just driver stand-ins.
The role of the co-driver changed slightly from being the man who would essentially plot the route from A to B and work out the time, how long they got to get from A to B, and exactly when they got to arrive at a certain place. Then we started to have recce's, and the co-driver started to make pace notes in, I think it was late 50s, early 60s.
Early pace notes were fairly primitive, and people got them better and better, and co-drivers became professional. Probably the first ones, people like John Davenport, Henry Lydon. Funnily enough, while the Finns and Swedes were becoming the dominant force in driving, the British were becoming the dominant force in co-driving.
Here to give you an experience of what rally in the 60s was like is Timo Mäkinen in the car of the decade, the Mini, on the special stages of Finland 1968.
Changing second gear. Changing third gear. And now it's coming long right-hand corner. Put it car a little bit sideways. Keep it out. And put it second gear. Out any clutch. I'm using left foot braking. Putting first gear, medium left. Sideways. And full power, second gear. And third gear. Brow. Jump. Jump. Very fast left. And plenty sideways. And away. Good. And sideways again. All time using left foot braking and keep the car balance with brake. Short corner. If you have short corner, don't put the car never sideways.
Rallying was now a professional sport. Drivers were being paid, co-drivers were reading pace notes, and manufacturers were flooding to high-speed special stages across Europe. So if the 60s was when rallying really became a sport, it wasn't until the 70s that its participants became sportsmen. It was the decade for change and the time where the sport of rallying gained structure, discipline and revenue for manufacturers. But even then, rallies were a very different affair.
The 1970s, well, firstly the rallies were a lot longer. The whole exercise was making sure you had the right tyres, the right fuel in the right places, squads of people. You know, it took 120 people to some of these rallies as well. So it really was a big military exercise, and it more about pacing yourself as well, because driving through the night, perhaps 3-day events, it was fairly long endurance rally.
It was Alpine Renault who dominated the start of the decade with their Berlinette, winning in 1971 with the late, great Ove Anderson.
Wonderful character, a true sort of sportsman, and sort of typical Scandinavian, Swedish, slightly reticent, never sort of the first person to speak, but always with a positive contribution to make.
In 1973, the FIA created the official World Championship for manufacturers, and it was Jean-Luc Tellier who helped the Berlinette become the championship's first winners.
He was maybe the most talented driver of all time, because he didn't have much of a work ethic, didn't enjoy doing recce's, and if there was no recce in an event, he would almost invariably finish on the podium because he was on even footing with everybody else. Liked to stop at service and have a bottle of wine at lunchtime, and a very relaxed guy, but just an amazing driver.
But the Berlinette's dominance soon faltered, and the big battle at the dawn of the new championship was an all-Italian one. Lancia's Stratos beating first Fiat's 124, and then the improved 131 Abarth Spider in 74 and 75.
That was probably the most astonishing rally car ever. This wedge-shaped beast with a Ferrari engine that made a noise like a Formula One car, the most exciting thing spectators have ever seen.
The Lancia, you had to drive very, very aggressively to get any speed out from it. But when you were brave enough, it was fast like hell.
It was a beast to drive. The appearance of the whole car, the shape, the sound. I mean, you were standing on a mountain, and 6 kilometers away, the start of the stage, you could hear it.
Lancia had unleashed a beast that had proven itself to be a force to be reckoned with. But the rivalry with Fiat took a new twist when they bought Lancia. Outside of rally, the commercial success of the Fiat was to be the Stratos' downfall.
Well, they dropped the Stratos because it was not the commercial car to sell. I mean, they should have built 400 or 500, which they never did anyway, for homologation, and there was no marketing interest in that car at all, so they switched to the Fiat 131, which worked really well for Fiat.
After defeating Lancia, Fiat's new battle commenced with Ford. The 131 beat Ford's Escort Mark II to the title in 77 and 78. Although narrowly missing out, Ford will have been happy with their Safari win in 77.
The value of winning that one event would outweigh 3 others, or even the World Championship itself. You could use that promotion year on year. It's a great endorsement of a car's reliability and overall performance. Safari Rally's always been that iconic event. You know, it went on for days on end. The roads were long and fast, very demanding and hard on the car, equally so on the crew as well, because it was pretty relentless. And of course, you never knew what was going to come on round the next corner. It could be a local truck, or it could be a giraffe, and the river crossings.
You had to plan it in a complete different way, and as more you get involved as a driver in testing and planning for tire chains, where should you take petrol, almost where should you stop for a pee. I mean, you had to plan everything.
And Bjorn should know, he won that Safari Rally in 77 in a Mark II Escort.
It was the 25th anniversary of the Safari Rally. It was the 25th anniversary of Queen Elizabeth to become a queen, and the 25th anniversary of Kenya as a self-independent country. So I think Ford felt the pressure, and the rally was 6,000 kilometers long, and it was the wettest, most horrible, most difficult rally ever, and we won it. So at the end of the day, when you see the boss of Ford and the European PR boss, when they kissed each other and cried, I understood I had done something very, very big.
Rally as we know it was born in 1979 when the FIA finally decided to create a world championship for drivers. Alongside Hannu Mikkola, Bjorn secured a manufacturer's win for Ford, but it was their battle for the first driver's title that kept fans glued to the end. And that battle was fought and won in the Ivory Coast. As Ford weren't competing in that final rally of the season, both drivers contested it in a Mercedes-Benz.
Hannu and I was fighting throughout the year, and Ford didn't have the budget to run us in all rallies, so they allow us to drive Mercedes on the African rallies. So the last rally of the year, Ivory Coast rally, Hannu had to win to be champion, and if I was just second behind him, I should win by one point. When I came to the finish and I was second, and people come to say that, hey, congratulations, you are the world champion. Oh yes, I'm the world champion.
Although Bjorn became world champion largely thanks to the Mark II Escort, he had already made his name in the 70s, managing the powerful Porsche 911s and mastering the Lancia Stratos, as well as notching countless other drives for various manufacturers on his bedpost.
Bjorn was clearly a great driver. Won San Remo when it was purely tarmac. He won Sweden many times in snow, won lots of gravel rallies, of course. Won the Safari Rally, I think, 4 times. So Bjorn could win pretty much anywhere.
I think he set the original standard for professionalism. The man never stopped working at test. And he never, ever, ever looked.
Escort Mark II, that iconic car which will forever be synonymous with Bjorn's success.
It was so controllable, it was easy to set up and run, the drivers could extract fantastic results and performances from them because of the nature of the car. It wasn't a particularly high-tech car, but it was strong, it was reliable, easy to drive, easy to service, but in those days it was the machine to have.
It was always the spectator's favourite, made a wonderful noise, and it was sideways, and it had the iconic drivers like Ari Vatten and Björn Voldegaard, Hannu Mikkola, Timo Mäkinen. I mean, all the greats drove that car.
The Escort's success continued into the early 80s. In 81, Ari Vatanen won the World Championship, co-driven by David Richards.
We went through the season either winning or having a big accident, and it was always like that with Ari. And it was not won until the final round of the championship in the Rally GB. And in fact, the last stage of that rally was very close to my family home in North Wales, and the last corner of the last rally of that year was the first corner I ever stood as a 12-year-old boy watching a rally. So it was a very nostalgic moment for me personally.
So the 70s, it gave us disco, Star Wars and Space Invaders, but it also gave us a manufacturer's championship, a driver's championship, the Berlinette, the Stratos and the Escort Mark II. Frankly, rally wouldn't be WRC now without the wholesale changes that this decade brought.